ABG drug testing, and that's going to be presented by Andy Foster. Andy, to the mic, please.
Can everybody hear me? So I had this presentation, and I'll email it to anybody that wants it. Okay, we made it and all this. I'm not going through it. I'm going to talk about something else. I was going to talk about drug testing and all this. We're going to talk about drug testing, but we're going to talk about what really needs to be talked about in this room, as opposed to me explaining the difference between testosterone and epitestosterone. Nobody cares. What we're going to talk about is things that need to be talked about right now and how we got right here. I don't want anybody to be offended, but this probably needs to be said, okay? Because we need to have a real frank conversation in this room, in this industry, about how we got here. So when I first started back getting into this, back just training and all this stuff, and John McCarthy's there in the back, so I don't go back into the boxing days, but when I first started training in the late 90s and that type of thing, and MMA was coming, there was no drug testing. Everybody remember that? There wasn't any drug testing. It was a free-for-all. And then as it progressed, what I like to call a little bit of some drug testing. And then a little later, a few years later, we entered into an era called the therapeutic use exemption. Commissions, me, some of you guys, we were just passing these things out like candy. Does everybody remember that? We were giving them out like candy, and there was an epidemic of hypogonadism in mixed martial arts. Okay, and to a lesser extent boxing, but we were giving out these therapeutic use exemptions left and right. And then in about 2013, I believe it was, suddenly we decided, you know what, this is not a great idea. So we're going to stop. You guys look around. You were miracle workers. We cured hypogonadism in mixed martial arts because those fighters didn't die. They're still fighting. Okay? A lot of them are. And now we're into what I like to call the era we're in now. So the pendulum has swung from one side to where there was no drug testing to now the pendulum has swung so far the other direction that we're punishing fighters for ridiculous amounts that are ultra-trace in substances, and WADA is going to change thresholds. Let me explain the difference between USADA, VADA, and WADA, and I'm sure everybody in here knows, but for the sake of anybody that doesn't. USADA and VADA, while they're nice companies and I like them, essentially they're sophisticated urine collectors. Not trying to be crass, but I mean, it's what they do, okay? The World Anti-Doping Agency sets the standards and accreditates labs as to what constitutes a doping violation in sport. Who in here has heard of clenbuterol? Pretty much everybody in the room. Now, what I bet you didn't know, because I felt like this could have been done a little bit better and the media didn't report this, does anybody know that the clenbuterol standard has recently been changed in the World Anti-Doping Agency? Because I bet you didn't know, because I didn't know until I was getting ready for this talk. It used to be no standard. Does anybody know what it is now? It's now 5 nanograms before you're adverse. if you come from countries that historically have problems. Mexican athletes have problems. We have, as an industry, and I'm not trying to knock us, but we're the regulators. We take information from scientists and make policy decisions on that information. We've been told they're adverse, and then we take administrative action, and we come in and we swoop in, and ultimately, a lot of times, careers are ruined. Francisco Vargas Salido, I'm going to use my own example. I was butchered in the press. Butchered. It did not make sense to me. I did not understand how you can have negative, 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 then a micro 1.3 nanogram trace, and then negative, negative. It didn't make any sense to me. None. Well, under the new standard, guess what? He's okay. That would have been fine. This is what I'm talking about. Canelo Alvarez comes to mind. Okay? Fine. All these fighters that have, and we are taking information from scientists, and what I'm telling you is, as an organization, we are going to have to discuss thresholds. Now, I think there's been a handout passed out. Okay? The handout shows the minimum World Anti-Doping Agency thresholds for a laboratory to receive the accreditation. There's a little line in there. You can go lower if your lab can go. I'm not certain what they meant was to have a nuclear arms race among laboratories, especially in the United States, to see how low we can go. We're down to the single-digit picogram level at some of these labs. Does anybody know how many picograms it takes to make a nanogram? Anyone? 1,000. The new threshold on clenbuterol is 5 nanograms before you're an adverse athlete if you come from Mexico, Guatemala, or China. It's an atypical finding. If you're not, you're up to the authorities to make that decision based on the situation. Something has to be, we have to have that discussion as an industry. Are we going to ruin athletes' careers from a lipophilic substance at the single or double-digit picogram levels that's coming out when fat is being burned? I'm not a scientist. I'm not trying to pretend I'm a scientist. I'm a policymaker, and I have to make the decision. It doesn't make sense sometimes. The point of my talk was all about this drug testing, and I'll send it to you, and you can look at it. But the point is what can we do as an industry to protect these athletes? Because you've got a choice. You've got to protect the public. You've got to protect the public. But part of your job is to use your head and think about things. Sometimes, many times the athlete's just doping. Many times. But if it's in that ultra low, and I'm talking about picogram, I'm not talking about recent cases where real recent cases where they're calling stuff Ultratrace, and then you see the numbers, and I as a regulator, that's not Ultratrace. There's nothing Ultratrace about 3 nanograms. Okay? But what I'm talking about is you take the water threshold, and the penalty should not be different if you get your test done in a water lab in particular, in say Montreal or Salt Lake or UCLA. You can't have a tail of 3 adverse tests. It can't be negative in 2 and positive, or it shouldn't be. It can be, it shouldn't be. Who in here has heard of Ostarine? Hey, everybody. Everybody's heard of it. LGD 4033. Everybody heard of that one? These are SARMs. Okay? They're not like They're not anabolics exactly, but they work like that. Okay? We're going to be seeing these things over and over and over as regulators because they're throwing these things in supplements. Okay? They're throwing them in because they work. They work good, and we're going to see them. And I would encourage each and every one of you. Nevada has a hearing coming up with the O'Malley case, and my whole medical group is tuning in to see what the guy who invented Ostarine, what he's got to say about it, how it acts, how it responds. Because if it's, the thing was made for essentially osteoporosis or whatever, if it hangs around for a long time, that would be helpful for us to know about. I wanted to show you a little video, and keep in mind, this guy's now clean. I don't have to do any explaining. Okay, this is the Francisco Vargas deal. And I was just butchered in the press over this. Oh, I want to show the video. Is this one it? How do I make it go? Oh.
Oopsie.
We looked at all the different factors surrounding this particular test. Probably the first factor that we considered was the fact that it was clenbuterol that he tested positive for. Well, that didn't help. It's not helpful. Well, anyway, you get the idea that I had to go in an interview and explain this away. I'm being just run through the ringer in the press. And now it's okay. That just blows my mind. And I'm kind of mad about it, to be honest with you. And you should be mad about it because you've had fighters and you've had to punish fighters for this stuff. And now suddenly they're okay. The thresholds are going to change. I think they're going to change in 2021. I'm not sure of that, but I have reason to believe that. And between now and then, we've got to use some common sense here on things. Now, one of the ideas that I use is I have I've decided that I've not liked to fine fighters tons of money anymore. Okay, they say, oh, you're just trying to take our money. My new thing is creative punishment, because you want to protect the public. You've got to make sure the athlete, the potential adverse athlete's fighting is, not in danger. You want a level playing field. So what I've started doing is I've started working out deals. It's been, worked out with the Attorney General's office where I'm requiring fighters to enroll in VADA and they'll get a reduced punishment. Done that a lot of times now. I'm liking the results that I'm seeing. Okay, so essentially it's a fine, because they're having to pay to enroll in the VADA program, and that's not cheap. But it's that, or just write a check to the state of California, and I'll sit you out a long time. That's your choice. And I've yet to have anybody not take the VADA, because if they're in the VADA program and I can ensure that they're safe, then I think that they should be able to come back and compete. Fighters have a short window. You guys have the responsibility. You guys have the responsibility of fighters' livelihoods in your hands, and you've got public policy in the other hand, and you're trying to balance. It's a balancing act, and you're relying on people. And I guess what I'm saying is the theme of this is I'm not sure that the scientists at these very, very, very low picogram and very low levels, I'm not sure they've got all this stuff figured out yet and how the body responds and how long this stuff hangs around. Okay, we saw that in many cases recently, and with the SARMs coming out, and we've never been able to test this low before. I never had heard of a picogram until about two or 3 years ago. Okay, before that it was always nanograms. So I would encourage the membership to think about the creative discipline if you can ensure that the standards are going to be okay. So without my presentation, the rest of it, I'm kind of out of things to say other than this. Use your common sense. That's the point. If it doesn't look like this person's doping and you've got a whole lot of tests to kind of prove it, you've got to think about things. If there's a positive surrounded by a bunch of negatives and you have enough time to ensure, why not see? Why not see? I'm not up here advocating doping, but I want to rehash and rewind. We went from no drug testing to license cheating to now we're throwing out fighters. By the way, I'm going to mention this. In the state of California, I'm going to do the punishments from now on. That's it. If they don't like my punishment, you know where they can appeal to? They can appeal to the commission. They can see the commissioners if they want to do something different. But I'm not going to allow licensees to be punished by groups that are, well, let me say this. The punishment from another group should not be more than any punishment that the state gives. And maybe people in here will hear that, and maybe they'll listen to that, but I'm serious about that. They're the state's licensees. They're your licensees. They're my licensees if they come to visit with me, and I will take that responsibility. I appreciate, and by the way, I hear this. I'm gonna finish with this. I hear this stuff, and there's in the press. I'm sure you guys read it. USADA is not dirty. Think about this for a minute. Think about it. These tests that a lot of these companies are given come from the United States Anti-Doping Agency. So that's how we find it out. So, I mean, just think about look, I've looked at the boxing stats. They raised my eyebrows, of course. But I have been told too many adverse tests from the United States Anti-Doping Agency for me to lose my faith in their drug testing process. It's the Smyrtle or the UCLA lab that are reporting these results anyway. Okay? My faith and what I think it needs to be looked at is the threshold levels. I'm probably going to have a summit in California at some point because we're going to take action on this. I refuse to sit around and wait for, just like clenbuterol got changed, I refuse to sit around and wait for these things to happen while athletes are getting just sit out. And I'm not up here advocating for doping, by the way. I'm not. I'm advocating for clean, fair sport. We need to think about this a little bit. This is not what the pendulum has swung from no drug testing to 3 and 4 year suspensions over. And then the suspensions aren't universal. They are okay for the same thing. This guy gets this, and this guy. It doesn't make any sense to me. Anybody got any questions? Mauricio? Yeah, Frank.
How could we change? What could we do to help?
I'm going to have a summit to determine like threshold levels. You know, and look, it'll just work for California unless the ABC itself adopted it. But, you know, I'm at 30,000 feet here, but like, you know, I'm kind of at where the minimum water threshold is at kind of right now. They've set that. And if an adverse test is good enough for any water laboratory, it should be good enough for me, okay? I mean, right now, most, you guys have got the handout, but I believe most exogenous is 2 nanograms, okay, most, okay? You guys got the handout, I think I'm right. I mean, gosh, it should be good enough. If it works for a water laboratory, if it works for the Olympics, it should be good enough for the state of California to call somebody an adverse test. But even if you wanted to go tougher than that, and you divide that in half and say half of the minimum standard, but you go to 1 nanogram, but I mean, it's getting the science is getting better. The technology is getting better. So we're talking about picograms this year. Next year we might be back and we might be talking about the thing beyond picograms. I don't know what it's called. I'm sure it's something. Greg Serb-grams. Yeah, Pat. Hey, Pat.
Here, Pat.
Asking a couple of questions.
Councilor.
Two questions. First of all, when you were talking about third-party penalties, I assume you're talking about third parties, not ABC commissions. Am I understanding you correctly?
Correct. I'm talking about drug
Got it.
testing companies punishing fighters, is what I'm talking about. So there anybody's clear
I got it.
here.
Okay, and the second really is not a question. Some years ago, the ABC adopted as a pretty strong recommendation to the commissions using the WADA standards. That's never been repealed. I think that's what you're talking about, using the WADA level standards. Yes, occasionally they do change, marijuana being a pretty notable exception as well. But is that what you're talking about, you think, at the end of the summit?
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. But what I'm talking about is that little, I'll give you the handout, that little blurb in there that says, okay, these are the standards, but if a lab wants to go lower than this, they can. It's that little blurb that if they wants to go lower than this, so like the standard's 2 nanograms, and we're getting adverse reports at 10 picograms. So we're getting adverse test. It's essentially 2,000% less than the threshold. Like 2,000%. And you know, look, I'm not saying that that's not a trace of this guy doping. What I'm saying is more probably needs to be looked at surrounding that particular test. Maybe you need, like, it was just like the Francisco Vargas situation. How did that make any sense? He had all these negative he's the one that asked for the VADA program. He wasn't going to fight Salido unless he had the VADA program. You remember that, Mauricio? It was your belt. You remember that? He wouldn't fight him, okay, until he had it. We have all these negatives, and then we have a low-level positive, followed by some more negatives, and then the results come in because, you know, how the lab. And I was on a plane getting off of Burbank when I found this out, and I'm like, what? Are you sure it's not? You know, because, I mean, I thought they might have. Anyway, and so when we got on a conference call, we talked it through. All I'm saying is this stuff is changing. If it had been 2019 instead of 2016, we wouldn't be talking about this, because guess what? We wouldn't have had to do any of this because he wouldn't be in trouble. Okay? I wouldn't have had to put him through that extensive. He wouldn't have had to pay that money. He wouldn't have had to done all this stuff. And I think the others are going to change as well. I think we're going to have a standard on SARMs one of these days. I think we're going to have because I don't think they really know how these things are behaving. For one thing, I know they don't, because you can't test a lot of these things in the United States. So you have to use like other testing things. But yeah, Mauricio.
Good morning. I believe that Andy's message might be mixed and confused. But what you are saying is absolutely the right path, because every commissioner is responsible when there's an adverse finding in your jurisdiction. And then you're going to be dealing, like New York has dealt, like we have had a very difficult times because an adverse finding can come 6 weeks out of a fight or a day before a fight. And you better be prepared to act. And the way to assess, we created the clean boxing program with Dr. Goodman and Vada. And that was the first case, Salido Vargas. And that was a perfect scenario on how to react to an adverse finding. When there's an adverse finding, it is not necessarily that you are, as an athlete, dirty and guilty. There's a process. And the key is to deal with each individual case separately. You cannot take as a generality, you have to deal with many things. What was the substance? How can you get that substance? What that substance does? What was the level? And you have to give the athlete the opportunity to show his case. We had Povetkin in Russia with a substance called meldonium, a substance in the Russian bloc. And that case took over 18 months to get through. And what you just said, 2 years later, WADA changed that threshold for meldonium. So had that fight taken place afterwards, there would have not been a positive. But the key is testing is a must, doping is a reality, and it can be a matter that can really harm an athlete. But most importantly, the athlete that takes any substance is hurting himself. What we are trying to do, and what we encourage every commission, if you create your own programs and make awareness, and you teach trainers and athletes, that's a big step to do precaution instead of going after something that has already happened. There's so many supplements that contain particles that will show up in a doping. So I really encourage you as an ABCCS group to look into the doping situation and not do it only as a state, because there's so many things happening out there. And I'm sure Dr. Goodman is going to talk later. They have an unbelievable program, and you can consult for free different agencies where they can tell you and teach you about the substances. But the reality is that doping is happening, and doping, we have to address it. But you have to do it also with the conscious that every case is different, and that every substance is different, and that you're dealing with the future of the fighter and the sport. Thank you very much.